Good morning. It is 9:44 a.m. Excuse me. On Saturday, August 17th, 2019. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. Excuse me. So last night after work, I finally made it out to see Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the latest Quentin Tarantino movie, and I thought I would talk about it a little bit, even though I have some ambiguous feelings about it that I'm probably not going to be able to explain 100% because I don't want to just spoil everything necessarily, and then also some of it's still ambiguous and complicated. Good morning to you. And so I guess let me start by saying that there is a fair criticism of this movie that if there are certain real life Hollywood history things that you don't know, there's going to be a whole lot of this movie that doesn't work because the whole point of what it's doing is subverting what the audience is expected to know about real history. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be an expert in those things necessarily, but if you don't know at least a couple of basic details about the real Manson family murders, there's going to be big chunks of this movie that don't make any sense and probably won't land the way they're intended to, because, again, like I said, the whole point is subverting it. A bit like Inglourious Basterds, where it's a World War II story, but at the end, it kind of, I think most people were like me in that you were kind of delighted to find that the movie decides to go for its fairy tale subversion and allow the heroes to actually kill Adolf Hitler, even though obviously that's not what happened in real history. So in some ways, there's a bit of a similar thing going on, and I don't want to say any more about it than that, except to say that if you don't now know anything about the Manson family murders and you want to see Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you will enjoy the movie more if you do a little bit of research on the Manson family and Sharon Tate in particular, who is not one of the Manson family but was one of their victims. If you know a little bit about that going in, you don't have to do an exhaustive study, but know the basic facts, you're going to enjoy the movie more. And I didn't know that, but had been tipped off that I should find out before I went to see the movie, and I am glad I did. So even though that is, to some extent, a little bit of a spoiler, it is absolutely something that will increase your enjoyment of the movie if you don't already know those things. Anyway. I don't want to spoil any more about that in terms of the plot. So I'm also not even really going to talk that much about the plot other than to just say the stuff that I've already said interweaves with the story of Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt's characters as they kind of just exist on their particular fictional trajectories in a depiction of 1969 Hollywood. And my ambiguous feelings about the movie are shared with my ambiguous feelings about The Hateful Eight, for example, which has a lot of things. So, let me talk about how I felt about The Hateful Eight to provide context. Though, in The Hateful Eight, first of all, I'm a sucker for that type of plot, meaning a diverse group of characters locked into a place with each other where they have to deal with each other, and it's all crazy. I love stories like that. And in fact, Bad Times at the El Royale, which came out last year, is, I think, an excellent example of that type of story, which I loved. But also, the movie is so long. And not all of it is enthralling for every moment. And yet, some of the things that really work in the movie work because of that slow pacing. And so I'm left with this constant feeling of the movie is not keeping me riveted for every second. But some of the later reveals work precisely because of the time we've spent with the characters that didn't seem like it was going anywhere. So, which of those things is more important, right? And then also in The Hateful Eight, for example, the character of Daisy Domergue, played by, God, I'm blanking on her name. The actress who plays her, which I'm kicking myself for not remembering right now, but that character is clearly a villain, obviously a fun character. She's an awful person, and it's not to say that she doesn't deserve the things that happened to her exactly, because she's awful. She kills a lot of people. But that said, some of the depiction of the glee that the male characters feel in beating her up or whatever feels uncomfortable. It's an area where the subtext and the text don't have a perfect alignment with one another, which feels purposeful and yet still makes me uncomfortable. And I would say, again, without trying to spoil everything, that the same thing happens in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where there are times where knowing all of the subtext of a situation would make us cheer something on, at the same time that the actual depiction of what we see on screen would make us very uncomfortable divorced of that subtext. And so then you're just left with this idea of, is the subtext enough to overcome the weight of the text? So if the two are making us feel different ways, which one wins? And it's hard to know. I'm not sure it's entirely successful unless its goal is to make me feel conflicted about how I feel about it, which maybe it is. Because there are definitely things that happen in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood where it's made very clear, or at least the movie's intentions are clearly to make us feel ambiguous about it. So, for example, there's a moment where there's a reveal about Brad Pitt's character that possibly could really change. The reveal really does make us change how we feel about him, but the reveal specifically is that there is an unknown thing about him, and the movie does not ever tell us that unknown thing. It just brings up the possibility of that unknown thing. We don't know if it's true or not. And the movie never tells us and wants us to live with that not knowing, which is ambiguous. And so one of the movie's central characters has a thing about his history that could make a very big difference about how we perceive him, and then explicitly denies us certainty about that situation. Which, yeah. So in the comments, Kimberly says, that could be the point, but Quentin Tarantino has some problematic interpretation issues anyway, so maybe not. Well, yes and no. Because I think that Quentin Tarantino certainly has controversies that are legitimate, like, some of the way he treated Uma Thurman, like in Kill Bill, kind of made headlines and everything. Although they supposedly have reconciled since then, it's clear that he had some. He was perhaps too cavalier regarding on-set safety to a point where it was actually dangerous, and that's irresponsible, no question about it. I mean, I think again, it's complicated to say what is Quentin Tarantino's relationship with women in his movies. And I don't even mean, like, again, the person. Let's just talk about the movies for a moment. Because on the one hand, he certainly does depict violence against women and so on, but he also writes pretty cool women characters. I mean, Daisy Domergue in Hateful Eight is really interesting. We think of the Bride as a very cool, interesting character. She's the hero, and she goes up against many other interesting women villains. Jackie Brown is very cool. You know, so he writes some good women characters, but it's messy. It's always messy. All of his stuff is just like got all of these sort of sticky pseudopods that grab onto different bits of cultural context, and it's very complicated. One of the other controversies about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is similar. It's not specific. It's not specifically to do with his relationship with women, but it kind of ties into the relationship with race a little bit, which is to say the very real person Bruce Lee appears in this movie in an interaction with the fictional character that has been created for the story. And so, again, it's a situation where the way that real person is depicted in this fictional interaction is like, well, is that a respectful depiction? Some people are saying no. Having watched it myself, I think it's a little bit more complicated. But I could certainly see it's again very much like the issue I talked about earlier, where it's trying to be ambiguous, but the problem with being ambiguous is that that's inherently an uncomfortable feeling, which is probably purposeful and yet also leads to people fully wanting to come down on one side or the other and then fight about it. And so to some extent you could say, oh, all the ambiguity is purposeful, and yet you could also kind of want to say, well, but why are you trying to do that? Are you, because one, I don't want to say disingenuous, but an ungenerous examination of that in his movies could be to say, you want to court doing awful, irresponsible things and then hide behind the ambiguity to cover yourself. Anyway, so I will say, as a summary, there is a lot about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood that I really liked. But like Hateful Eight, it feels long. It's definitely like, it's like, I think 2 hours and 49 minutes or something like that. And it feels long. And so I'm not convinced that the slow pacing was absolutely required, and yet I'm not 100% convinced that the things that I liked about it would have worked the same way without that pacing. So, but there are definitely things about it that left me feeling uncomfortable too. The Hateful Eight and this one both had that quality in ways that his previous movies frankly didn't, and so I'm not sure what's going on there. I don't know. Anyway, I think I'm going to leave it there. So I'm going to leave it there for now, and I will talk to you all tomorrow for 5 more minutes. And it's Sunday, of course, so I'm continuing my rewatch of Gravity Falls. So